Hi, everyone. I'm Chuck Murphy. This is Key Takeaways. Today, Maggie and I are going to be discussing mindfulness. A recent State of Our Health report that we published had some interesting data, and we've been talking about it internally. So we thought we'd do a podcast and share some of our thoughts with you. And we think there's some really interesting trends going on. Hope you enjoy. All right, we are ready and raring to go here. Today, we are going to talk about mindfulness and a fact that I found a little bit shocking, but Maggie thought was very pedestrian, wasn't surprised by at all.
I didn't say it was pedestrian. I just said it was to be expected.
You were wise to the mindfulness growth in a way.
My third eye told me it was going to happen.
So I'll tell you the backstory of this. So this actually came up like a month or two ago near the end of Q1, when our State of the Health team was working on a mindfulness kind of deep dive report that got published like a month or two ago. And there's a chart in there that shows mindfulness growth by year, basically. And from 2019 to 2026, mindfulness has gone from 38% on a weekly basis up to 50%, which to me struck me as like a really sharp increase for a behavior that, there's nothing really new about it. It's been around forever, right? And it's a fairly basic part of our kind of day-to-day lives. So I just thought that was really shocking. I was like, that's a really sharp increase. And it wasn't all a COVID bump. In fact, most of that growth has come post-COVID, which I think is really interesting. So that's where we kind of started this discussion. And we've had multiple over the last couple of months. I've brought this up multiple times, and we've talked about it with different people in terms of why do you think that is? What do you think's happening? So we thought we'd do a little podcast on that and kind of go through our different thoughts and feelings and hypotheses about this, and see, just see if we can land on anything that is close to consensus. But maybe we should start with the fact that you were not surprised by this in the way I was.
I think that it's always interesting to see a upward trend like this, like consistent growth. So I think it's fascinating. But when I reflected on, okay, why could that be happening? I think this trend fits with a lot of the things that we're seeing in traditional media, that we're hearing about even in exercise-based apps, or that people are talking about. So I think the way that we define mindfulness in this survey it's pretty broad. So it's essentially any sort of gratitude ritual, any kind of self-reflection or journaling, meditation and prayer, mindful movement, or app-based exercises. So that would be like Headspace or something like that. So a meditation app would be counted in that. And to me, I think that if you think about the things that we're hearing consistently, whether it be around, hey, you need to spend more time sleeping, recovering, so there's like a whole industry building around this idea of recovering and taking time and space. There's also this sort of fever of information coming at us all the time. And I think a lot of consumers want to find quiet, stillness, and space. And then the third piece of this is I think we've seen that consumers are like people, not even consumers, are looking for sort of like community. And that's why we're seeing in some cases a return to things like church or a spiritual practice that may have waned a bit in the past decade or so. So I think like a combination of all those factors, to me, it makes sense that more people would be engaging in these types of practices on a more frequent basis. But yeah, I would love to know why you think it's so surprising or sort of, not what you're expecting.
Well, it's funny. So whenever there's something like this, like I like to noodle it for a while, and then I feel like I have to come up with kind of like a 3-part story. I think after noodling on this for a little bit, I think that it does appear, and by the way, before we go into that, let me go backwards and just throw a few facts out of people that I just thought were interesting. And we could also, we have this data. It's a, mindfulness has always been a part of State of Our Health, which, we've been doing for, what do we decide? 8 years now, I think, since 2017. So we have a lot
2018.
of
I think 2018 was the inaugural
2018.
year.
We have,
Yes.
well more than 100,000 completed, surveys on this now. We have men and women of all age groups across a number of years, so we can kind of track this data. Really interesting. And just a few facts on this mindfulness growth. So it's gone up by a third in the past 6 years, which again, to me, that's a really, really big increase. And there is a lot of stories and ink spilled about this, but I think I just kind of wanted to dive a little deeper into it. But that increase of a third, it's fairly like there's a slightly different trend line for men and women.
Mm-hmm.
And back in 2019, women practiced it more than men by about 10%, and now that gap persists, right? But both of them have gone up over those years. The generation trend lines are slightly different. The younger generations sparked really quickly during COVID, especially millennials. Like, I think that for whatever, obviously COVID caused a particularly anxious shoot there. Or maybe you have another theory on that, like they were targeted.
No, I think that makes sense. I also think that there was more, I think that the COVID impact explains a lot of the millennial growth in mindfulness, but it's sustained. I think that's what's interesting about it. It became like it wasn't just something that was done to combat, the anxiety associated with COVID. The millennials have really stuck with it as a trend for the most part.
Yeah, no, they have. And they're, the millennials and Gen Z are the highest endorsers of that practice. Some of that might be a language thing, but I think a lot of it does kind of make sense. The boomers were the lowest through every year, but they have also grown, all the generations. Mm-hmm. Gen X were a little bit later adopters than Gen Z and millennials, but they're catching right out there. And so I just thought that was like a kind of a fascinating trend. But anyhow, back to like, in terms of me, like this is what I'm kind of settling on is like a high level story for there's three phases of this that I see. The first phase, I think we have to give Calm and Headspace a lot of credit, right? Mm-hmm. It's these early apps that were out there talking to especially younger people saying, hey, this is important, that you kind of are more intentional about certain parts of your day. And it's funny because I do think it's interesting to tease these different dynamics out, but obviously when you say mindfulness, if you're talking about something like prayer, meditation, the spiritual side of yoga, the Buddhist monks, whatever, it's been around for thousands of years, right? Like we've had these things forever. But in a lot of ways, the term mindfulness and the way that we currently think about it, to me, does kind of come back to the launch of those apps and the fanfare they got. I thought they were funny when they first launched. And, I remember, I met with the founders of Headspace, years ago, like this must have been like 2014 or 15 or something. And we talked to them, and it struck me as it didn't seem like something that would become that big to me. It seems, but I think they deserve a lot of credit in kind of starting to tell that story early.
Yeah. And I do think that meditation is a really daunting practice if you don't know what you're doing. To sit still and to like calm your mind in our current society is hard. And so to have a way that sort of explains, and if you look at some of the early stuff that Headspace did, like the tutorials they had in the app and things like that, it was really smart. I mean, it was well done and it was simple, right? So it took this thing that was hard and complicated and made it very digestible. And I mean, there were 5-minute, I think there were even like 1-minute meditations. I mean, it was very bite-sized and approachable. And I also think they were really smart about how they integrated it into different parts of lives. I mean, I believe that for many, during COVID, there were times when it was entirely free. You could get on there and you could use the app without any cost at all to sort of, get you started on it. I think they've worked hard with businesses to figure out ways to, help corporations offer it for free. They did a lot of cross promotions. I remember I was doing like a Nike run through their app, and there was like a cross promotion with the Headspace guy, and it was like a meditative run. So I think like they were really smart about how they rolled it out too. But the key being they made something hard very accessible to the everyday person who had no idea where to start. And I would also say, I think, and this is kind of part of the other platform that's done this, and there are a bunch of them that do it, but like there've become platforms like that for therapy, right? Where it's much easier to find a therapist, to meet with a therapist, to do it virtually. So like that's become much more accessible than it would have been, 10, 15 years ago. And I do think part of that was because the regulations during COVID allowed practitioners to work with people online or across state lines. Like it became sort of easier to practice that type of thing, which made the platforms more accessible to more people. So I think I agree with you. Like I give like Headspace a lot of credit for sort of figuring out how to actually make this something that consumers could interact with in a very easy way. So went on a tangent there, but
one of the things I think about is interesting. So in the 90s, back when I was very young, I worked for this. It was an AIDS response program in San Diego, and at that time, it was basically a death sentence. And one of the things that we had to do, so as clinical psych, is we would get approached by all of these spiritual providers, right? Which was, but they made us as therapists do each of these things with these different providers before the provider could be introduced to any clients. And they did that because they were skeptical of them, right? Like if you think about it, it's really interesting. And I remember at the time being very skeptical of a lot of this stuff. And there was all different versions of this. There was like energy healers, there's pure meditation. There was all different versions of kind of spiritual slash. But I think that they were viewed with a lot of skepticism. And I remember doing a lot of this stuff and actually being very surprised by how well it worked. Like I was like, wow, that's really interesting. Like I never would have thought it worked. But then you fast forward 20 years and I think therapy is kind of in a separate bucket.
Yeah, agreed.
But I think you get something like Calm and Headspace, and they did mainstream, some of this stuff and started talking about it in a very natural, easy, accessible way. I think they sort of, anyhow, not to talk too much about that, but if chapter 1 is the launch of these apps, chapter 2 is clearly COVID, right? We know that COVID had a massive impact on all of this. And it's the COVID part, I think is always hard to tease out because I sometimes think with a lot of people, they explain, like when you talk about, say, the rise in anxiety, right? A lot of people explain it or they really believe that it's an effect of COVID, when really I think it's an effect of smartphones, right? The screens are really the thing that happened. The COVID period just was this like super intense, short-lived. Like you can always point back to that. It's like, oh, anxiety went way up during COVID. It's like, no, I think anxiety was building the whole time. COVID was a separate stressor, right? Like, but it's really the screens and the always on and the I can't get away, from whether it's work or, always reachable all the time, that thing buzzing, the notifications. It's not a natural way to live, right?
I totally agree with that. And I would sort of add to that, COVID gave us this space where we were kind of stuck in our homes. And so there was time to experiment with new ways to either deal with this or try new things. I mean, I think about how many hobbies I started during COVID, some of them more crazy than others. But like, I think if you were at home and you were anxious and you were like, hey, there's this thing I can do, this mindfulness trick that I can try, you had this sort of space and time to try it during COVID. And so I wonder if it was sort of like the stress was building and COVID gave us in some strange way the space to experiment with some of these mindfulness activities.
Yeah. I mean, another way to say a very similar thing to what you're trying to say is COVID was like our rock bottom with screens. Mm-hmm. Right? It was like, this doesn't work. I'm not happy. Like a lot of people, and you would hear a lot of parents talk about that during the period, like Zoom school. Parents would be like, Zoom school, right? And there's still people that are just so mad about that. I do think in a lot of ways that was like a little bit of there's this promise. There's always this promise in technology that it's going to bring this utopia, and you're going to be able to you could talk to anyone wherever you want. It's all great, right, and true in some ways. But there's also this. I think there was this kind of for a lot of people there was this realization of like, nope, this doesn't work for me. Like I need people. I need to be outside. I need whatever they need. So COVID was like their rock bottom in this, and I clearly think that, especially as we said, there's a generational story here. For a lot of people, COVID was the point where they needed an antidote to the over intrusiveness of technology, and mindfulness kind of really spiked from there.
Yeah, I think, it was a time of uncertainty as well. And in times of uncertainty, I think you look for anchoring behaviors that help you process that information. And a lot, beyond just sort of meditation, but like the self-reflection and journaling and the gratitude pieces of that, I think work really well in times of extreme anxiety, where you're like, I'm going to focus on things that I can be thankful for, or I'm going to, use writing as a way of processing the things that I can't quite understand in the moment. And so I think a lot of those probably, grew during that time frame as well, beyond just the meditation piece of the puzzle. And, I also think that there's a lot of, there is research around, if you are practicing gratitude, does lead to more happiness in your daily life. And I can't cite any of those like any of that research off the top of my head, but there are, it's sort of proven that if you are someone who has a daily gratitude practice, you are generally would report to be happier than the rest of your cohort. Now, again, you could say there's a chicken and egg effect there, or causation correlation, but I think that there is there are actual stories about that in, probably on social media as well as in traditional media. So there is support for a lot of these behaviors actually making your life more meaningful or better to some extent.
Well, the crazy thing about some of this stuff that's really interesting to me is like journaling is a great example. Like psychologists have known for 100 years that it's actually one of the best things for your mental.
Totally.
Psychologists have known that for a long time. Like there is something, if you go back to Freud, called it catharsis, right? But it's like a connection of thoughts to feelings that does seem to have a relief for anxiety, depression.
I think even journaling is a difficult thing to say. It's difficult to start journaling, right? It's not something that is you're just like, I'm going to journal, if you've never done it before. But not to toot my own horn, but I'm an avid journaler, have been my whole life. And I like a plain piece of paper in a notebook to journal. But what I've noticed is that there are now so many different types of journals that will break down the steps, or there's the 2-minute journal, or a journal where you literally check boxes and things like that, as opposed to having to write a free-flowing narrative. So I think even even journaling has become something that has been made more approachable for people who are trying to start the practice of it. Now, I don't know if that process is as effective as just writing down your thoughts, but I do think that so many of these things have easier ways in than they might have 10 years ago, which may be another reason why we're seeing the rise, is because it's just so much easier to get involved in one of these activities than it was before.
Well, yeah, it's funny. Like you go from, like I mentioned Freud, right? Like this like open-ended kind of analytic view of the world, to then like CBT, which is like closer to where like, a lot of the current thought is, but it's more structured, right? So it's like, here's a structured thing to follow, as opposed to this unstructured time with yourself. And maybe this is a good time to say, like, the third big piece of this story is, I'm trying to think what the word for this is, but I was kind of astounded. I was, obviously I've been thinking about this for like a couple months, and we've been talking about this for a little while, and I've kind of, looked at different aspects of it, but, this has become like a big structured business, basically, in a lot of ways. And, mindfulness, it's a $2 billion market now. And there's some reports that think it'll be $7 billion by 2030. And one stat that I found that I thought was fascinating. And again, you always have to, there's all these different reports out there, and you have to, some people have an angle, but I found this study by this organization I've never heard of, but they said 59% of new mindfulness adoption comes from structured corporate wellness programs, and that 4,500 companies in the US signed a mindfulness program contract last year, which I thought was really fascinating. Like I don't necessarily think that's untrue, because it's a good benefit that is cost effective, right? So that's not a super expensive contract for a benefit manager.
Yeah, absolutely.
We know that they like to have a lot of benefits, and if something, but there is this element, as it's become a business. There's also a lot more evidence behind it, right?
Mm-hmm.
There's some of that is because it's becoming a bigger business. Some of it is just naturally like people have gotten better about structuring programs and then studying them, right? There was this study in the Lancet that showed that a CBT based mindfulness, so a more structured mindfulness version that was specifically targeting depression, was just as effective as antidepressants in preventing relapses as medication. So it's like you're getting more and more evidence, which makes it easier for bigger programs to adopt, and it just grows. And so I think that's a big part of this. Like what I would say, the third chapter is like it's kind of emerging as a legit, industry. It's not viewed as niche.
Yeah, it's fascinating. I mean, we're so skeptical about so many things, but it's amazing to me that there is less skepticism here in terms of all the different ways that you can be mindful and the potential health impact that they can have. I mean, I think I was thinking about where I see sort of mindfulness show up in my daily life, and I was doing a Peloton workout the other day, and at the end of it, one of the instructors talks about gratitude, and I was like, oh, that's fascinating. And she's been talking about it for a long time, but I'm like, it's sort of showing up in all these different places now where it might not have shown up before. So I feel like the sort of nomenclature of it is everywhere. And so people are more like, yeah, of course we should be meditating, or we should be journaling, or we should be in nature. And I think that there's also there's this strange, and I'm not going to articulate this well, but there's this strange pull between and I think this kind of goes back to your screen, too much screen time or the smartphone piece of it. We're getting bombarded with so much AI and kind of like the, trying to figure out what's real and what's not real. But the idea that you can like sit in nature and, sort of reset yourself or kind of have this like return to normalcy, I think is really appealing for a lot of people right now. So it's sort of like the antidote to all of the artificiality that's coming at us. You can be like, oh, I can take a minute and like stare at a tree, and that becomes like my way to balance the rest of my day. So I actually think that it will continue. Like if we had to like predict the slope of this line, I mean, it probably won't continue rising as quickly as it has since 2019, but I think it's going to keep going up. And I think that the things that we consider to be mindful will also expand. Like I think that there will be some like new, or maybe like we'll bring in more things from 1,000 years ago that kind of complete the portfolio of mindfulness behaviors and activities. So I think the business is going to keep growing. I mean, it makes sense. I mean, 2 billion to 7 billion in 4 years seems like a really crazy growth, but like, I don't know. I mean, like it's not impossible, right?
No, and it's funny with the business growth. I think is this they've got better at packaging and selling it, right? Like, and it's when we talk about like the actual practice of mindfulness for us, like for if we're talking to individual people, prayer is still the top one, breathing exercises. So but the business stuff I think is a little bit more. It's not that growth is more about them being able to package and sell it. But do you think it's interesting? Like that's one of the things I found fascinating about this chart when we first looked at it is like, for most people, right? Like if you take out like, female millennials, for most people, this has been a steady slope, a steady march upward. So I was wondering, like, okay, so like right now, for example, like your females were 47% in 23, 50% in 24, 52 and 25. They're already at 53 after Q1 of 26. Are we going to get that number to 60 in the next 4 or 5 years? I think
so.
Going to continue.
I mean, I don't think it's never going to be 100%, right? There's a point at which it'll.
Well, or is there a point where there's a little rebellion against it? Like, I'm over this, and you see a sudden.
I don't think so. I mean, these are very like. I don't know that you can say there's a downside to some of these, right? So I don't think it'll ever. I mean, it'll probably if I had to guess, it'll plateau out at like 2/3 of the population does some kind of mindfulness activity. So there's still room to grow,
So in 3 years, we're gonna come back and see if we've seen that dip. You know what I always think of whenever we talk. I do think it's funny because there's different angles of this too. I mean, I think we could talk about religion. I think is interesting, but the other thing that I think about all the time is just Putty on Seinfeld. Just sitting on the plane and staring forward, and they're like, "You don't have a book. You're just gonna sit here." And there's now influencers that do that. I don't know how much you've seen this, but there's this little movement on some of these social media folks to fly without a device or books or anything, or to
I love that they're still telling you they're doing it, which sort of negates the purpose of doing it. But
well, I know, and it's funny because it started. I feel like this started a couple years ago with the whole flight thing, and they have I'm not going to say the words they have for it on the podcast, but it's funny because all the social media trends for this tend to have ridiculous terms attached to them, but when you pair it with actual data like this, there is something there, right? Like these aren't just dumb. The influencers are picking up on something, but the ones that sit out on the porch and just stare. I think that there's something to that is really interesting.
I mean, your mind needs a break. We are just inundated with stuff all day long, right? So it's like a mental pause for your. I mean, I think there's parts of it that are much more spiritually connected than that, but at its base level, it's a way to be like, oh my gosh, I'm overwhelmed by what's happening in my life. I need a pause, and I think we're going to see that more and more.
So let's talk about that part, because I think this part is another interesting little thread that you could pull on this. When I first saw this chart, and I first pushed the team, what's driving this? Why does this continue to go up? Uh-oh.
It's time to be done. I'm just kidding.
Your laundry done?
Actually, it's time for me to meditate. I'm kidding.
Oh, okay.
I'm totally kidding.
But when I first pushed the team, what's driving this? What's driving this? The answer I got was religion. And prayer is the number one mindfulness exercise. But the thing that's interesting to me about that is if you look for other data points on religion, it's very hard to make the case that religion is growing. Most data points suggest that religion is shrinking.
Yeah.
Now, it could be a language thing that people are more likely to pray and then call it mindfulness, but say they're not religious, right? So you have that whole quagmire. It could be that the nature, but do you how much of this do you think is religion? Do you buy that?
So if in our own data, I think the religious piece of this often skews a little older, right? So it's more likely to be the older end of our of the data collection pool, and so it's a little bit more structured for boomers and potentially older Gen X. Having said that, I do think that there's prayer doesn't have to happen in only in a very structured religious format. I think you're right about that. A lot of you can pray without going to church services, or, you don't have to be with a pastor or minister or those types of things. So I think there's probably some of it is less structured prayer, and that drives some of it. But there's also, I think that, yes, that's a piece of it, but I think all the other things are kind of catching up to that too. I think it's just I think that people are finding what works for them, and that's driving up the total number of mindfulness. Now, I mean, I've heard anecdotally that people are looking more for community right now, that there's a desire for sort of group gatherings, and religion is a great way to do that in some respects. So maybe that's part of it, but I think yes, in our data set, prayer is the number one thing that people do as a mindfulness exercise, but there's also a lot of people doing other things too. I mean, breathing exercises is only eventually 11 percentage points behind prayer in terms of, what people are doing for meditation. And, they're not mutually exclusive. My guess is, and I actually should have this number, but don't, is that someone who does mindful behaviors probably does more than one mindful behavior, because it becomes sort of a way of, it becomes habitual or sort of a lifestyle choice at some point. So my guess is that there's high overlap across some of these behaviors.
Yeah.
I'm not sure I actually answered your question, but sort of the short answer to that is, yes, I think prayer is a big piece of it. I don't think it's the whole story, and I don't think it's the only thing driving these.
It doesn't seem to me. It's funny. We actually we could delve deeper into this, but I think it doesn't seem to be the growth to me. The prayer seems to be, 39% of people who are mindful say that they've been that way for more than 5 years. So there's obviously a group of people that have not changed as much in the last 5 years. I would guess that it's some of the other things like structured breathing and some of the stuff that goes back to what the apps provided, what the wellness programs encourage.
And I think another question we have in our mindfulness battery is sort of like, why are you doing this? Like, what's your motivation behind mindfulness? And the number one thing, 69% of people say that it's a mental health or a stress related reason that's driving their desire to be mindful. And spirituality is at sort of the bottom of that list of motivators for why you become mindful. So I think, I think that there is a broader belief that mindfulness behaviors serve your health and your stress management than there used to be, and therefore more people are engaging in these practices.
Yeah, and there's no question about that. You could find evidence, and the neuroplasticity thing is a good thing that you mentioned it before. Like, we now understand. It's funny to me because a lot of this stuff, like when I was training as a clinician, like older clinicians would tell you this stuff, but it didn't. I think a lot of people were skeptical of it, but it's like, they used to have that joke about, smiling can make you just as happy can make you smile. Like, you can look at these stuff both ways. And if you do kind of focus on some of these things, you can change your brain, and there's a lot of evidence now. And there's also a lot more adoption of like things that we would have called holistic or Eastern like 20, 30 years ago.
Oh,
like
totally.
a lot of those are much more mainstream than they were.
Even if you think about what insurance covers now, I mean, like insurance regularly covers acupuncture services, which I don't think it did 10 years ago. And I would think of that as part of sort of like holistic health, mindfulness connection. So absolutely.
Yeah. It is really interesting.
Yeah. So if we come back in 6 years from now, where do you think that number will be? I gave you my guess. I think it's going to top out around like 2/3 of the population engages in mindfulness. Do you think it's going to be higher or lower than that in 6 years? 5 years. That sounds better.
I do think it's gonna go a little bit higher. I think it's a fascinating trend because I think that we're kind of in the middle of this like arms race right now to grow AI and grow this technological like coat that's all around everybody now, and that stuff is gonna be even more and more compelling, right? Like if we think about how compelling a smartphone screen is, like the next 3 to 5 years as we start to see what they do with AI and some like I think this stuff is there's powerful forces trying to suck you into those screens. Yeah. But I do so I think there'll be this kind of push to fight that a little bit. But I also can see an AI version of these meditation apps that's really cool. You know what I mean? Like,
I'm going to call it scary. Others might call it something else. But I mean, I think a lot of people use ChatGPT as a therapist now, or as a sort of spiritual guide, which to me is scary. But if it gives you the help you need, maybe that's great. So I don't want to pass any judgment on it. But like I think we're already sort of using some of these AI or generative tools as a mindfulness a way to be mindful. And I don't know if that's contradictory or therefore it is not mindful, but I absolutely. I also think the opposite of that may become true, where you need a touchstone back to reality or to be grounded. And so you use mindfulness as a way to get really escape all of the technology-based things that are coming at us. So I think it could be sort of, as you get overwhelmed by technology, you need mindfulness to stay sane to some extent, and therefore it'll grow from that perspective too.
Yeah.
That's my approach. I'm like, I need some reality. I'm going to go stare at a tree. I'm going to walk in nature.
Well, you were ahead of the curve. You were the one that really wanted mindfulness in State of Our Health, right? Like
I did. I mean, I think
ahead of the curve on that.
It's interesting to me. There's another sort of set of data within State of Our Health that kind of straightforwardly asks, how connected is mindfulness to other areas of your life? And I was, most people say it's connected to mental health or spirituality. It helps fuel social relationships, but not so much around, it's not as connected to fitness and nutrition yet. And I actually think that's going to grow more too. I think, there's been for decades, probably even longer than that, like mindful eating has been a big thing. But I wonder sort of like how fitness and nutrition trends will ultimately be impacted by the idea of mindfulness, and how the three of them will connect more in the future, because I think that's sort of the next place this goes, right? If mindfulness is about mental health, and ultimately it becomes about your broader well-being, and that includes fitness and nutrition. But I'm not sure how it all connects yet. I'm still working through that in my mind. The other place I've been thinking about it a lot is like, as when we go to shelves in the store right now, that's overwhelming sometimes too, with all the choices that you have. And in some ways that's great, right? You can get exactly what you need. But is there like a mindfulness kind of overhaul of retail at some point where it, focuses more on like a serene experience? I don't know. Probably not. But
I mean, that's the famous mustard study right there, right? Like,
right.
There you go. Shout out to my UC Irvine anteaters. Can't remember that woman's name, but there's that professor did her mustard study.
Yeah. I mean, that like the too many choices makes you less happy type of thing. But like, so how does that all ultimately come back together in a more consumer perspective? So
Costco, baby, 2 SKUs. That's it.
There's something to be said for that, right?
That's it. They were onto something very early. They know what they're doing.
Right. Unless they pick the wrong 2 SKUs, and then it's terrible.
That's why everyone ends up with 47 types of mustard. They're worried. Yes, no, this, no. You got to go back and read the mustard study again.
Yeah. Well, anyway, I love that we got from mindfulness and meditation to mustard. Like that is how broad our conversations are.
Perfect. Yeah, it fits exactly what we do, right?
Exactly. Yeah, and I know, but I love this. I love that we include mindfulness as part of State of Our Health. I think it's a fun thing to think about, and clearly an area of growth.
It is. Yeah. No, it's great. I think this report is really interesting, and I've now read it like 4 times. I keep going back through it.
Yeah.
All right. Well, I have a 12-hour flight tonight, so do you think I should just bring a clean sheet of paper and just sit with my thoughts?
I do. Do you want me to send you a journal? I have one that literally asks you yes, no questions, if that's the kind of journaling you're into. I've never opened it, but they exist.
You've never opened it. Okay, well, we'll get into that next week.
I have a different journal that I use. Trust me, I have so many years of journals. But yeah, I think you should stare and you should write down all your deep thoughts, and then see what happens. Maybe you'll come back completely refreshed and ready to go.
Deep thoughts with Jack Handy. Okay, that's gonna be my entertainment for the flight.
Yep, I love it. You need to set an intention before you start too.
Do you remember that? Do you get that reference? Deep thoughts with Jack?
I do. Of course I do.
Gosh, I'm saying we're like the right age to remember that. Half the people listening are like, "Who's Jack Handy?" Maybe we should end this podcast with just a bubbling brook, with some words flowing over it.
I love it. I love it.
It's so good. All right. Well, this was fun. And we'll get back to this next week.
Love it.
All right.
Thanks.